I was backpacking alone through a state forest. This area and whole trail really was regulated to where it had designated campsites that you had to reserve. However, it was a long trail. I think 80 miles if you were to backpack the whole thing. So, as far as how often any rangers came through to service it, it was probably very rarely. The designated campsites were more for bear safety and just keeping the forest clean, as well as to ensure there's a record of how many people are out in the wilderness and for how long. Regardless, I did my due diligence and reserved 2 campsites. One at the 12-mile mark and another at the 26-mile mark. All the individual sites were very spread out, so I think the closest ones to me were a mile or so away. I made the long hike up to the first campsite, arriving midday and resting for the rest of the afternoon. During my hike and the time I spent at the campsite along the trail, I never saw a single other hiker or backpacker. It was off-season, so I wasn't surprised, but it was something I just took note of. I went to bed early and slept well that night, only waking up once to what I thought were footsteps coming down the trail. I don't remember much of it because I fell right back asleep afterward, but I know I thought it was strange anyone was walking the trail that late. It was probably 2 or 3 a.m., but it didn't bother me enough to ruin my sleep. I woke up early, had breakfast and a cup of coffee, then packed and headed to the next campsite. The trail was as empty as it was the previous day. This hike was 4 miles longer though, further and deeper into the forest and with more elevation, which meant I didn't make it to the next campsite until late. The sun hadn't gone down yet, but by the time I had my tent up and my fire going, it was getting dark. I still hadn't seen anyone that whole day, which at that point it was a little strange just how inactive it was. I tried to just enjoy the silence while I had the chance though. Several hours went by. I didn't have any hiking to do tomorrow, so I was staying up later. Think it was 9 or maybe 10 o'clock when I heard footsteps far down the trail from the way I came. Right when I turned around, I saw a light, too. Just a small headlight moving in between all the trees, getting closer to my campsite. Thought it was pretty crazy for anyone to still be hiking several hours past sundown and immediately made the connection to the person I'd heard walking last night as well. Although, if it were the same person, I would have had to have passed them at some point. So, how did I not see them? I figured it was nothing, but still was curious enough to keep watching the light. The person got closer until suddenly the light stopped moving. It looked almost like the light was facing toward me, and then a couple seconds later, it moved and veered off the trail, going into the forest away from my camp. And maybe 20 seconds later, it turned off. No light or footsteps anymore. It felt like just when the person had gotten close enough to see me or my campfire, they tried to vanish, like they didn't want anyone to see them, which was kind of concerning. Had the person just have passed by, I would have still thought it was strange for all the other reasons, but not concerning. What the hell could they possibly be going off the trail for in the middle of the night and turning off their headlamp? Not to mention it was just when they had gotten in view of my campfire. I kept looking in that direction for, I don't know, had to be 15 or 20 minutes, but after the light shut off, I didn't see anything. I guess I thought after so much time had passed, the person likely set up a small campsite somewhere out there just to sleep. Maybe they had reserved a camp a couple miles north and started running behind, so with it being late, they just stopped for the night, coincidentally right near me. It still didn't explain the night before, but there was no way to know if it was the same person. An hour passed. I'm not sure why I was still awake tending to the campfire. I didn't get tired for some reason, like my body wanted me to stay up. So I listened to it and stayed awake. Whatever the reason, I'm thankful for it because suddenly I heard something behind me. It was a very quiet crunch of leaves just beyond my camp, like a person trying their best to take a silent footstep. It was close, way too close for comfort. I jumped up and looked out, but couldn't see anything. Whoever was out there immediately stopped moving. I quickly reached into my bag and pulled out my flashlight, shining it straight into the forest. Standing eerily close, just 10 yards from me, there was a man. Right away, I noticed he didn't look at all like a hiker or backpacker. The guy had normal clothes and no backpack. And strangely, he didn't move when I shined the light on him, like he hoped I still somehow didn't see him. Wasn't until I called out, "What the hell are you doing?" that he hesitated, like he was about to run, but then decided to just walk toward me. His face grew into a smile, and as he got closer, something was off. Something was familiar. I recognized him from somewhere, but I didn't know where. And then he said my name, greeting me like we were good friends. And although I was sure I'd seen this guy somewhere before, I knew that I'd never talked to him or introduced myself or anything like that. Like I'd only seen him in passing or something and nothing more. So, how did he know my name, and why was he out here creeping around my camp? I realized whoever this was had been following me. Not just tonight, but the last several nights, long enough to have followed me all the way out to the trail and into the forest, which explains why he didn't look like a backpacker at all. He'd likely been trailing behind far enough that I'd never noticed him, and then would walk around at night looking for me when he thought I'd be asleep. The man was still smiling and walking closer as everything came together in my head in just those few seconds. He said my name again, this time saying it as if confused why I was acting so scared. I backed up and grabbed my bag. The man's face fell flat, and he asked what I was doing now in a monotone voice. I didn't answer, strapping my backpack on and moving toward the trail. He said my name one more time in an aggressive yell before his footsteps started getting quicker. I bolted down the trail, keeping my light off to try and lose him. But thankfully, he didn't seem to try and chase for very long, running on the trail behind me for 15 seconds, but never really leaving the campsite. I walked through the entire night and used my satellite emergency phone to contact authorities while I tried to get as far away as possible, eventually meeting a park ranger several miles away from the camp I stayed at on the first night. I got out safely after that, but they never found the guy out there. He didn't have a car at the trailhead, and no reservations. However, for him to get out of that forest unseen, he would have had to hike off trail probably for dozens of miles in the right direction. And in a forest like that with almost no gear, that's incredibly difficult and honestly unlikely to survive, even for an experienced backpacker, let alone for some random stalker who followed me out there and likely had no real backpacking experience. But given that I still have no idea who he is, other than someone that I'd seen sometime before, it's terrifying knowing that if he did make it out, then he could still be watching me. Who knows? Maybe the times I saw him before were from him stalking me and I just didn't know it yet. But if I'm being honest, there's a dark part of me that hopes he never made it out of that forest. It was just this past fall. I live fairly close to a lot of camping areas and trails, so I went for a lot of hiking and camping trips and often didn't even plan them. I'd find a trail real quick, pack my things, and head out the next morning. This was another one of those quick, spontaneous camping trips that I never could have expected to become what it did. When I pulled up to the trailhead, about an hour from my small town, no cars were there. I locked up my car and threw my backpack over my shoulders and started the hike. The woods were just as quiet as they always were. No signs of anyone out there. My head was clear and I was just looking at the ground, walking calmly down the trail, when suddenly I heard crunches and cracks ahead. I looked up, seeing something move in the trees far down the trail I was on. As they got closer, I saw it was a man coming quickly down the trail. And when he got even closer, I got sort of uncomfortable. He wasn't just jogging. This guy was in a dead sprint. I moved off to the side to get out of his way. I watched him as he sprinted past me. He had this look on his face that was hard to read. Not frightened necessarily, but just sort of crazy, like he wasn't thinking straight. His eyes seemed to be glazed over, like he was looking through me, almost like he didn't even see me. I watched him for a couple seconds after he passed by and he just continued running. So, I got back on the trail and started walking again. It was so strange though that after maybe 30 seconds, I did a double take and looked behind me again. I felt my stomach drop. The man was far down the trail, but he had stopped running. He was standing still, staring right at me. I quickly moved my eyes back forward and kept walking, scared to look back until another 30 seconds had passed. And when I did, he was gone. Not on the trail, not anywhere. Just gone. Obviously, I wanted to get away from that guy because he was acting pretty unsettling, especially for being out here alone with him. But after a few minutes of walking further down the trail and into the woods, I started to wonder if he was running from something and if I was walking toward whatever it was. However, my only other option would have been to turn back and go in the direction of the guy who kind of freaked me out. And again, he didn't really look scared of something. He just looked crazy. So, I took my chances and continued hiking to the campsite. I looked behind me every couple of minutes, still uneasy about that guy, but I didn't see any signs of him. I made it to the campsite and set my stuff up. There wasn't really anything distinguishing about the campsite I was at. It really was just a spot in the middle of the trees. No campfire rings or landmarks. And usually the quiet, soft sounds of the forest would bring me peace. But this time it felt too quiet, like something was out there. I continuously wondered if I had made the right choice to stay here rather than turning back. I kept telling myself the man might have just been doing sprints for a workout or something, and I just overanalyzed everything. But really, I knew I was just hoping if I told myself that over and over, maybe I'd start to believe it. The sun got lower and the already calm and quiet woods grew even quieter, nearly silent. Every slight rustle of leaves in the distance was easily audible. I cleared out a spot and built up a very small campfire, giving me at least a bit of light once the sun was fully gone. It had to be an hour past sundown when I heard a very familiar sound that instantly made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Footsteps sprinting through the woods, maybe 100 yards out from the campsite, too far to see anything. But I was sure it was human footsteps, not just some animal. Each step was distinct. The sound stopped after just a short burst though, like they had run a little ways, then abruptly came to a stop. And it was silent again. I thought the campfire would give me comfort, but now it just felt like it was giving me away, showing exactly where I was and making me easy to spot. And even though whoever was out there likely already saw me, in the heat of the moment, I made the horrible decision to quickly smother the fire. Suddenly, it was pitch black. I stood still, waiting for any sounds, hoping to hear the person walk away or even run away. I didn't care as long as they left. Every minute that passed just got me more nervous though. And then it happened again, someone sprinting, but this time directly toward my campsite and much closer. But then they abruptly stopped again. Felt like they were so close, nearly right in front of me. I stared at the same spot in the darkness where the sound came from until my eyes slowly adjusted and could make out the shape of a figure standing there. The person was halfway behind a tree, standing still, and I couldn't see much details of their face. But from the way they stood and were clearly looking at me, it was almost like they were observing me. Nothing a normal person would be doing. And I really couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, but I was pretty sure it wasn't the same guy I saw running on the trail. So, either there were multiple people running around out here surrounding my campsite, or this is what the man was running from. I was scared to move. I didn't want to speak either because I knew my voice would be shaky and I didn't want to give away just how scared I was. It felt like both of us stood motionless, staring at each other for a whole minute until the figure started backing up. Even just a couple steps back, they had entirely disappeared in the darkness. And just as eerie, their footsteps quietly faded, too. They must have been quietly walking barefoot, intentionally not making a sound. Since the moment the figure moved away, it stayed silent for a long time. My adrenaline pumping made it hard to tell just how long. It felt like hours, but realistically, I think it was probably around 30 minutes. I didn't move for that whole time. When I finally did, I knew I had to leave. I blindly dug through my backpack and got my light out, then started taking down my tent. I stayed cautious while taking it down and repacking everything. The light I had wasn't great, really just enough to see what I was doing. Definitely not enough to be searching around for the person in the woods. They could have easily been just 15 or 20 feet from my campsite still. I didn't know what intentions they had, but I hoped by leaving and not looking threatening, they would leave me alone. I started back down the trail. Although I never saw anyone again or heard any more footsteps, knowing how silent they were moving near my campsite, I was still on edge and they very well could have been following me. Even just that thought of them creeping behind me, following me through the woods was enough to keep my adrenaline going through the whole trail. When I got to my car, I quickly got in and drove out of the forest, not sticking around for a second longer than I had to. And it wasn't actually until the following day that I noticed some scratches on my car door and the handle on the passenger side was broken, like it had been pulled on so hard that the latch snapped and left the handle unusable. That was the final nail in the coffin to get me to call the police, but aside from my report, it led to nothing significant. I don't know if it was the man I saw that tried to get into my car or if it was whoever was out in the woods watching me. That single event derailed my whole love for camping, which really sucks. But with all the possibilities of what could have happened that night in the forest, I don't think I'll ever be out there alone ever again. A few years ago, I was in between jobs and not having all that much to do. I thought I'd rent a camper van and go on a long extended vacation. I ran all the numbers, and while I could have used my savings and flown somewhere nice for a week, with a van I could take a 3 or 4 week vacation. And I wasn't a city person either. I loved nature and wanted to get out and try camping in a slightly safer and more accessible way. I didn't know how I'd feel or if I'd be comfortable being alone in the middle of nowhere with just a tent. But being in a secure metal box with the ability to drive away felt like it'd be better, at least for my first couple of times. Anyway, I got the van and headed north to where all the national forests and free public lands for camping were. The first couple of days of traveling, I ended up staying the night at truck stops just to sleep and continue driving. I think I was trying a little too hard to have my first campsite be some spectacular place rather than just paying for a nice campground or something where I could settle in and figure out exactly what I was doing. But it was on my third day that I finally had a chance to camp in the wilderness. I was on a long stretch of road with nothing but public lands for miles in all directions. There was an app one was using to try to find campsites others had stayed at, and I had a few marked on my GPS just in case one didn't work out. But what I didn't plan for was that none of them did. Every time I'd reach one of the spots, there was nothing there. No trail, no other campers. Just nothing. I must have driven an hour on this unpaved rugged road, failing to find any of the campsites I'd picked out. I began getting frustrated knowing I was getting really far away and it was getting late. I felt like I was racing against the sun because I knew once it was down, finding one of the seemingly invisible trails would be impossible. I couldn't even go on the app to look up different nearby campsites either because I no longer had service. I would have had to drive an hour back just to find some more campsites that might not even be there. So I kept driving, and after a while I happened to barely see a path leading away from the main road. I was already 30 minutes past all the campsites I had marked, and this was the first trail that I'd found. It looked even more rugged than the current road I was on, but the van could definitely fit. And while I couldn't check the app to see if this was a campsite others had stayed at, I figured it had to be, as it was connected to the same road that all the other ones were supposedly on. I backed up and pulled onto the trail. My headlights lit up the way as I slowly drove through the trees and down the path. It went on for about 5 minutes, and then I reached the end. Just a single small spot barely large enough for the van to fit in. There were no other little paths going to different campsites. It was just this one, which to me, for my first time being out in the wilderness, was unsettling. I hoped wherever I'd stay would have other campers nearby just so I'd feel comfortable. Being entirely alone just felt a bit much for my first time. I stayed parked for a few minutes, sitting in the front seat still and looking out into the woods. There was this really dreadful feeling in me about this place. I hated how alone I felt, and my gut was telling me to leave, that something wasn't right. On any other normal day, I would have pulled out, reassessed, and found somewhere else to go. But I was so frustrated that I just settled. I also thought, since it was my first time being out here, maybe my mind was panicking more than it should be simply because I was out of my comfort zone. I turned off the van and moved to the back. It was already dark out, so there wasn't much I could do outside of the van until the morning. I laid on the bed for a minute to relax after the drive. But then I heard crunching steps outside the van, and before I could even get up, there was a loud knock at the driver's side window. I'd only been there for a few minutes, so I was sure it had to be another camper. I must have missed them while driving down, or just didn't see the other campsite. I walked up to the front and saw a man standing by the door, peering through the window at me. He gave a short, sort of awkward, not trying to bother you smile. I asked if everything was okay. He said yeah, that his name was Mike and he just wanted to swing by and say hello to his neighbor before it got too dark. Now, of course, I was new to all of this, so I wasn't sure if this was common courtesy or what. One is that I still had no idea where he was camping or how he was this close to where I was. And two is that it was already dark out. The sun had been down for a while. Lastly, the man was very twitchy, shifting around a lot, and his eyes constantly darted over my shoulder like toward the opening into the back of the van. Kind of like he was expecting or waiting to see someone else come up behind me, which just made me more nervous about being alone. I said thanks for stopping by being nice, but trying to cut off the conversation because of the weird feeling I was getting. As I started to back away from the window, I noticed the man didn't move. He kept his feet planted and watched me move into the back of the van. I waited 15 seconds before peeking through the curtain, and when I did, he wasn't there. Immediately, I started looking out the smaller windows around the van, looking for any lights or something to show me where his campsite was or even where he walked off to. Surely he had a lantern or flashlight to walk through the woods with. I was able to look out pretty much every side of the van and I didn't see any lights at all or see him walking around anywhere. The trees surrounding my van were all dark and quiet. No signs of a camp being nearby. I thought about leaving again because of course it didn't feel great being alone in the middle of the woods with this guy that gave me a strange feeling. But I thought if I could just see where he went or where he was staying, I'd feel a lot safer. Like he wouldn't be able to sneak up on me so easily next time. I checked out the windows for maybe 20 minutes, circling around and never seeing a thing. Before I realized if I couldn't figure this out, then I would have to leave, and I really didn't want to go through all of that again. So I decided to get a better look. I went to the front, opened the door and stepped outside. It was extremely quiet and nearly pitch black in all directions. Even the trail I came down was hardly visible. I stood there and turned my head looking around for any signs. I felt this looming uneasy feeling in the air that made my whole body have chills. Again, my gut was telling me to leave, and that's when I heard a short shuffling sound from right behind me. I moved to the other side of the van and looked around, not seeing anything. The sound came from right behind me though. I hesitated, then slowly knelt down looking under the van. I only caught a glimpse of the man's eyes looking back at me before I jumped up and ran back inside. I heard him call out and the van shook a couple times as he crawled out. I only got in a couple seconds before he jumped up and started banging on the door. He was still twitching in strange ways and his eyes had a savage, animalistic, violent look. It almost reminded me of animals with rabies. That's how insane he looked. He was punching the window with everything he had. I turned the van on and started driving. I could hear him trying to grab onto the van, still trying to get in. The trail out was rough and I really couldn't afford a flat tire or getting stuck with this guy chasing me. So several times as I was trying to get out, the man caught up and tried to break in still. But it was around halfway that I'd gotten enough distance and was able to get back to the still rugged but better road. I drove 2 hours back to a small town. I didn't sleep at all that night thinking about what had happened. I genuinely think if I had stayed or the man had gotten in, I never would have been able to leave that forest and probably never be seen again. The look in his eyes and the crazy sadistic behavior he had once I found. Him hiding still terrifies me to even remember.